Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. This morning, someone was asking about the experience of fear when we first begin to practice. How often we're letting go of all these things we've depended on and fed off of, distracted ourselves with, oriented ourselves around. Old hobbies, relationships, ways of thinking about ourselves, Netflix, everything. And this sense of disorienting and trepidation that comes when we suddenly find ourselves on a new path, letting go and seeing through all the things we used to touch and hold to, but not yet completely understanding what's coming to replace it, what we're stepping into. And it reminds me a lot of, well, first a Dhammapada verse, which I've quoted before, where it's the first. The Buddha says, the suffering follows the ill-trained mind, like the hoof of an ox, or the wheel of a cart follows the hoof of the ox. Even so, suffering follows the ill-trained mind. Where happiness follows the well-trained mind like a shadow that never leaves. And the overlooked aspect of this verse that people so often don't pay attention to is the comparative coarseness and subtlety of each of those objects. Our suffering, those things we've clung to, are coarse and easily seen, just as the ox's hoof, just as the wagon's wheel. And these are the things in our lives that we know aren't good for us, and yet they're the only things we know. This is the self-deprecating habit of tearing yourself up over a past fault, or pushing yourself and tying yourself up into knots to achieve a goal in an unhealthy way. It's the addiction that you know you need to pull back from but can't. The relationship you know you need to let go of. We know these things aren't good for us, and yet, more than even pleasure, we desire to feel solid. And in Buddhist doctrine, the self, people frequently ask, if there's no self in Buddhism, what carries karma? How can karma carry over if there's no self? And first of all, the Buddha didn't say there was no self. Not self is a strategy, and what you come to once you let go of these false identifications is beyond language, beyond self or not self. But even the question is backwards, because it posits karma within the context of self, whereas in Buddhism, self arises in the context of karma. Karma is patterning, continuity of habit. And in the Buddhist thought, that sensation of self, of selfing as an action, is a habit. It's a piece of karma. So self happens in the context of karma. There is a continuity of craving and of habit pattern of programming. And one of those programs is the feeling, or rather the feelings, of self. And what's so useful about that recollection is the understanding, if we look carefully, that each of those patternings of self are different slightly. The self-righteous self has a different feel, a different valence, a different voice than the pitiful self, than the self-flagellating self. And yet that sense of a kernel as the subject, which is solid and immovable, which we orient around, is more important even than any sense of love we might have for ourselves. And so when we rip ourselves apart again and again over a past action, over not being good enough at meditation, at life, at relationship, at the career, as we fail, because we do, inevitably, when we are a disappointment, as we inevitably are, and sometimes, then the clinging to that habit pattern is also seductive and addictive, because it is a way of crystallizing the self again and again. And even though it's coarse and rife with suffering, it's all we know, and so we cannot release our grip upon it. This is the ox hoof, and this is the cartwheel. The shadow that never leaves, which is happiness, that image is subtle, where our mind easily sees and identifies the coarse materiality of the suffering in our lives, of the coarse habit patterns. It misses time and again, our eye just passes over the subtle and sweet happiness that's light as a shadow. And this is the great challenge of our practice. We're stepping away from something we know that is solid and touchable and tangible, habituated. And we're stepping into a landscape, a field, which can seem empty at first, until our eyes adjust and we see that the hand that was formerly clutched around so many stones and so much suffering is now filled with a subtle pool of light. But at first, all we see is the empty hand. So this is where our faith comes in. And this is the great fault, in a sense, of Western psychology, and of the news cycle, for that matter, and of our lives, is time and again it gets caught upon all the coarse suffering which is so easy to see and easy to chew on. The Buddha frequently uses the analogy of a dog chewing on a blood-smeared bone. There's no nutrients there, and all it tastes is its own saliva. And yet, similarly, when we chew on these things, all we're really taking in is our own craving. That's really what we're feeding on. You see this in Western psychology in how it focuses on all the disorders that human beings have. The DSM-4, I think I've mentioned this before, had about, I think, 1 page or so dedicated to positive mind states, and over 900 dedicated to all of our neuroses. And Freud, in the interpretation of dreams, famously said that the best he could do was change your neurotic misery into normal human unhappiness. Similarly, the news cycle, there's a great website called coronavirus.org, which we cleverly tried to name our retreat in January before we both actually got coronavirus and had to cancel it, which is ironic. But it's a great website dedicated to goodness and good pieces of news, where he's looking at the normal headlines, what attracts the eye and the clicks, and therefore dominates our landscape, is the whispers of the serpent, is all the negative and the suffering. And then in our lives, how we love to gossip about this or that, how we cling to those things we know we should let go of because they're what we know, and it's what the eye fixes on. There's a great line in a poem that says something like, there's immense strength in walking away from the stone that one has been pushing all one's life. And in The Four Quartets by T.S. Eliot, there's another line where he says something like, one does not love yet because one is not ready for love. One does not hope because one is not ready for hope. It's as if one is in the subway car when it stops in the middle of the tracks in the dark. And there's waiting, but the love and the hope and the faith are all in the waiting. And when the Buddha says that patient endurance is the supreme practice, I think this is what he means. That we have to sometimes step onto this path with wisdom, but acknowledging that it can take a time until that subtle happiness begins to pervade all of the things we know. That sometimes waiting is the best we can do, and yet that simple act of waiting and inviting, of being willing to step away from the stone we've been pushing our entire lives, is a great gift to ourselves and the supreme act of love, because it is not immediately visible as love. And this takes very practical application at times too. Ajahn Nisabho says that wisdom takes us to the edge, but faith is what allows us to jump. And so, yes, last week we heard about, from one community member who'd stepped away from a life of addiction into this path, expecting to find some measure of stress relief, and found a path to happiness. We heard from another who quit her job to run off to a monastery, and all the faith that entails. And then there's everyone here, so many of us, who simply have begun to step upon a path that those around us do not understand. The same person this morning said that if her roommate had known what she was sort of having insights into, then she would have had her committed. And I think that is how a lot of people felt when I told them I was going to go to Thailand and ordain. And how many feel when we talk about sitting with our eyes closed in our rooms in quiet. There's a great study I like to reference where they locked a series of participants in an empty room with an extremely unpleasant electric shock administering machine. And within about 15 minutes, people just started shocking themselves to do something, even though it was very unpleasant. So that's where most of the world is. What Buddhism provides is a paradigm of positive psychology. This is our great gift to the world. The Dalai Lama says that, look, Western science has come a long ways on a lot of different fronts, but Buddhist psychology is years and years ahead of Western psychology. And this is completely true. When one looks at the subtlety of the 12 links of dependent origination, or simply the cultivation of the bright qualities of the mind that Buddhism espouses through meditation, this cultivation of the emotional intelligence, and particularly the 7 factors of awakening. This is a paradigm that no system, as far as I can tell, has developed as well as the Buddhist articulation. So for those who don't know, the 7 factors of awakening, this is the light that begins to manifest in that dark subway tunnel. This is the subtle happiness that rises to meet us as we step on this path. Reminds me of that scene in Indiana Jones where he steps onto that sort of crevasse without seeing a bridge, and then there's a bridge there, something like that. And the factors are mindfulness, sati, Dhamma Vichaya, investigation of Dhammas, which leads to virya, effort, energy, which leads to piti, P-I-T-I in Pali, which means rapture or refreshment, which leads to passaddhi, which is tranquility of body and mind, which leads to samadhi, unification of mind and heart, concentration, which leads to upekkha, which is equanimity, equipoise. And just as when the coarse neon lights of the city dim and that buzzing of locusts, or that buzzing of the neon, which sounds so like locusts, fades, and we can suddenly see above the stars those Pleiades, the 7 pointed constellation of the sisters. These 7 factors of awakening are our guiding stars that rise or begin to glow from what our eyes initially perceive as just darkness. And they're so much sweeter and more subtle and reliable than the blinking neon bar signs. So there's a great deal to be said about the 7 factors, and I'm thinking it'll be something for several talks. But we can begin by pointing to a sutta called the Pariyaya Sutta. It's in the Samyutta Nikaya, 46.52, and it's in it the Buddha frames these 7 factors in a fascinating way. An analogy might be a seesaw with 3 axes. First of all, though, the Buddha points to the 7 factors as balancing mechanisms. 3 of the factors are active. They involve activating the body and mind, arousing energy. 3 are calming and tranquilizing. So piti, rapture, bliss, is active. Dhamma Vichaya, investigation of Dhammas, is active. Virya, energy, is obviously active. Passaddhi, tranquility of body and mind, is calming. Upekkha, equanimity or equipoise, is calming. Samadhi, concentration, is calming. And mindfulness, the seventh, the Buddha says, is always useful. And in the sutta, in the Samyutta Nikaya, the Buddha says that just as one, when having a blazing fire, would not put more dry kindling on it, but keep it at a measured burn, so if the mind is agitated, one does not necessarily turn one's attention to the active factors of virya, energy, piti, rapture, investigation of dhammas, but rather turns one's mind to the calming factors. And if the fire is dying, then one does not put damp sticks on it. And even so, if the mind is calm and or slothful and tired, one turns to the active factors, not the calming. And interestingly, mindfulness is what allows us to see where one applies the attention in each of these moments. Where's the mind at, and what is appropriate in that moment? So the Buddha says that each of these factors gets paired with another. Each active factor has a calming correlate. And the three-tiered seesaw is of three different lengths of axis. So Dhammavichaya, investigation of dhammas, and upekkha, equanimity, this is the longest seesaw because it involves both external and internal phenomena. One can contemplate the internal world and the external world, and one can be equanimous about the internal and the external. The second seesaw, which is slightly shorter, is piti, or rapture, and virya, energy, and passaddhi, tranquility, because these involve the body and the mind. It's not external and internal, but it's a little shorter, but it still involves both the body and the mind. Piti, rapture, and samadhi, concentration, just involve the mind. That's the shortest of all the seesaws, which we balance upon the axis of mindfulness. And the Buddha says that each of those can be accompanied by thought or not. So that's quite a lot to take in. But we can first begin just by talking in concrete detail about that quality of the longest seesaw, of Dhammavichaya, investigation of dhammas, and equanimity or equipoise. So when we meditate and take stock of the mind, then this quality of investigation of dhammas is frequently how we begin the meditation, because it uses the active energy of the mind in the service of samadhi or concentration. So instead of beginning to sit and trying to crush all of your thoughts and just bring the mind to one spot, instead you use that thinking energy in the service of the Dhamma. And this is what investigation of dhammas involves. It's an active way of using that energy and moving towards calm. Though it's an active element, all these things lead towards lucidity and centeredness. So when we begin mindfulness of breathing, the Anapanasati Sutta directs us to measure or take note of the length of the breath. And this is how we can really begin. When we center around the breath, take note if the inhale is short and the exhale is short, if one is long, and you can adjust to feel more comfortable and to find balance. So if you're feeling tired, then you can really emphasize the in-breath. Or if you're feeling agitated, then make much of the exhale. And if you begin the meditation by noting the length of the breath, it's a concrete way of anchoring the mind again and again until that energy has settled a bit and you can just be with the breath without commentary. Similarly, if you use more active approaches to the breath, such as visualizations, the one that I reference the most is a very simple method where you divide the body into 3 chambers, from the neck up to the crown of the head, from the neck down to the navel, and from the navel to the tailbone. And first place awareness in the upper chamber as you breathe, just imagining the breath as a white, bright mist moving in and out, saturating. And when the mind becomes tired of resting in that position, let it drop down to the heart, that middle chamber, and do the same. Relaxing any knots you feel and saturating the whole body. And then let it drop to the 3rd chamber, the lowest. And after it's done all 3, then one expands awareness to stretch from the tailbone all the way to the top of the head, to encompass the whole body, but centered at one point where you feel the breath most prominently, such as the tip of the nose, like a spider at the center of a web, but aware of the whole web. And this active use of visualization is a form of investigation of dhammas. It's Dhamma Vichaya. You're actively using the mind. And this is where you begin to play. Try different things, because the kilesas, the defilements, will block each of these techniques at some point. But the beauty of mindfulness of breathing is that you can use other means of interacting with the breath to find a way around those blockages. So think like a thief, in the words of Ajahn Jeff. You can imagine that white mist coming in through the back, through the kidneys, through the shoulder blades, saturating the body. Or if the body feels solid and too difficult to force that visualization of the breath through, the breath as energy, not as simple wind, then you can imagine the breath or that energy flowing along the outside of the body, down the front of the body and up the spine in a circuit. Just as the winds would flow along the top of the water of the ocean and direct the currents a little bit, just a light touch. And Dhamma Vichaya is seeing how that affects things. Try it and then wait and see what happens. And then if that doesn't work, then one can bring to mind loving kindness. And sometimes one will find in meditation that the mind just won't settle. And that's when it's most useful to identify the hindrance that is drawing one away, because that's a very good use of the meditation. Even if one isn't able to achieve calm, if one is able to see what particular flavor one's neuroses is, that's a good use of a half an hour. So is it sensual desire? Is it thinking about the movie or the past? Is it aversion, the argument we've had in our head 1,000 times? Is it sloth and torpor, drowsiness? Is it restlessness and remorse? And take note of that pairing, because it's a very interesting pairing. Restlessness and remorse. They come together. Is it doubt? What's dragging you away? And just name it and let that be your object for a time. That's investigation of dhammas. And just as a fire cultivated correctly begins to burn clean and clear and steady, that's the quality you're looking for. Does the mind begin to settle into a clear, lucid brightness, a sense of settledness? If your investigation, if your active use of the mind is leading to that, then that's correct. Or there will come times when you just release and put your foot on the other side of that seesaw, sitting in equanimity, equipoise, just watching the breath. This is why so often I give the two objects simultaneously of the breath and kindness, is that for me, I can be with loving kindness for a long time, but then the mind will become happy and settled, and it'll just want to be with the breath for a time. And you need to give it permission to do that, to stop with its investigation of dhammas and just rest in equanimity, just watch the breath. And trusting that it will know which to do. So just give yourself permission to have one foot in either object, and when the mind gravitates to one, then allow it to, and keep the other in the periphery. And when the other rises and you find that the breath has become dry, then raise up love again, that sense of brightness, or simply holding yourself with goodwill and care. Or maybe you need to apply an interesting perception of light, something to spice things up a little bit and re-engage your interest in the meditation. That's Dhammavichaya. And then, of course, there's how we do it, how we apply these qualities of investigation of dhammas and equanimity in our lives externally. Because this is the unique aspect of this pairing of the Bojjhanga, the 7 factors of awakening, equanimity and investigation, is that they apply to the external world too. So, when I came back to the West on election night, I frequently mention, one of my teachers in Thailand, Ajahn Siripanyo, said, look, you can go back into the maelstrom of news that is the West, but if you watch any news, your responsibility as a practitioner, as a monk, is you can't let even one unwholesome state arise. Tall order. But it's the standard, and this is the Buddha's great compassion and ferocity, in a sense, or his fierceness, is that he gives us, this is our standard, this is our responsibility. There's always a way of contemplating and looking at things that is wholesome. There's a thread of Dhamma and purpose and harmony that runs through even the 24-hour news cycle and can lead us on there without our hearts being shaken. Not to say that one should watch the 24-hour news cycle. In fact, take a big step back if you can. But if you find that such things do come onto your radar, then can you use them as a contemplation? Can you look at the Ukraine war and see the suffering on all sides? Can you see that this is one more indication of how this world externally is not a refuge? Not that we shouldn't try to help it and make it better as we can, but that there has to be another story of the heart that is above even that, because this is how the world has been forever. And the Buddha existed in the midst of a similar and much worse maelstrom of slaughter and patricide and betrayal. And he did it with utter equanimity and love. And he received the criminals and the lepers and the kings and the patricides. And he taught them the Dhamma with love and compassion. So can you take the picture of the political leader that you really, really don't like, and can you put that on your shrine right below the Buddha, not right up with him, and can you bow to that every night with compassion. And if you can't do that, in the words of Ajahn Nisabho, if you can't spread metta to someone, can you spread it to their chair? Or can you just not bring them to mind for a time? Because that's sometimes the best we can do. We have to remember how wounded we all are. Those without practice so frequently live life as if with a huge gaping wound, and it has been reopened again and again through our entire lives. And it's okay, once we found the path, to give ourselves a long time to heal. It's okay to step back and to care for ourselves, and to acknowledge that we are all very sick, except for the arhants. They're doing all right. They're the only normal ones. And so this is how we investigate. And when we can't do that, when we can't come into a relationship with that level of mindfulness, and one can see if one can maintain that level of mindfulness by if one can maintain awareness of the body while one is with another, or by measuring how much residue a relationship, an interaction, a show leaves in one's meditation. And if one has a way of being present enough and with enough mindfulness to use Dhammavichaya, investigating the dharmic thread hidden in every one of those situations, then great. But as soon as you lose that, then you have to remember that your ultimate purpose and responsibility as a practitioner is to care for your own heart, because what you're cultivating is of unspeakable value. And you only really see it when you meet those people who have cultivated it to perfection. But I've seen monks like Ajahn Pasano, like Ajahn Sucitto, like Ajahn Anan. And what they do in every person they touch, they can save a life just by a 5-minute interaction. I've seen people be shaken to their core by that. What you're cultivating here is not of mean or small value. It is of immense worth. And that is your responsibility and is your gift. So if you can use Dhammavichaya, great. And you'll need to keep up a modicum of practice, basic hygiene, 20 minutes of meditation a day. If you can do 40, that's great. If you can do an hour and a half in terms of 2 45-minute sessions, even better. But that's quite hard for many. But keep some measure of anchoring yourself so that you can do that. And then when you sense your mindfulness slipping, or that the relationship is just too much, or this person is too toxic, that's when you step into equanimity and just back away and turn off the news and stop and tell the person you care about, but that is not healthy for you, that you just don't have the resources right now. And remember your heart. Time and again, the Buddha says that each of these qualities introduces or heralds the coming of the Eightfold Path, like the dawn heralds the sunrise. And this is just the case. As we step back from all these things we've known and have touched and held to, and it could seem like just darkness at first, that we're stepping into our great unknown. But this is where we begin to have faith, to turn our eyes to the bright factors, the Pleiades, that steady brightening of the sky, that is the dawn coming, to the good friendships around us, to the Dhamma, those we care about, to that subtle but growing sense of a sweet but utterly serious voice in our hearts that guides us on this path. and paying attention to the subtle but gnawing sense of emptiness that manifests when our footsteps stray, because that's just as important to notice. And having faith that that brightening glow will grow little by little and guide us on this path together. And I think I'll save the other 4 for another talk.
Anda mayang damakataya sadhu karang dadamase.
Sadhu, 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 anumodami. Don't know if I'm supposed to sadhu my own talk, but I figured I should guide you all anyways. Okay, we have a bit of time for discussion now if people have any topics or questions they'd like to talk about. Yeah.
What do you recommend when the kilesas are strong, the hindrances are strong, but it's hard to identify what it is, and how to sit with it, how to work with it?
So the question is, what do I recommend when the hindrances are strong, the kilesas are strong, and it's hard to know exactly what to do to sit with it? The smorgasbord, right, of kilesa. I'm trying to think about the question, but my left foot is asleep.
I guess also to expand, kind of when you sense a feeling that it's just kind of a heaviness and a darkness, but you don't know how to look into it further. Yeah. So to expand more, you have a feeling and it's kind of a headiness or a darkness, but you don't know how to look into it further. I think in practice it can be I like thinking of practice as a tiered structure. And you have your coarse tier of where when the mind is really a mess, where you're not just going to be able to sit and follow your breath. And in situations like that, it actually has a parallel to this whole seesaw analogy, I guess, where that usually uses the external and the internal qualities for me. So when my mind's really restless or a lot's going through it, sometimes I'll memorize suttas or do a few chants, or then do walking meditation. And then at a more subtle level is like mantra, followed by just focusing on the breath, followed by really letting go of other thoughts and just focusing on a subtle sense of energy in the breath. And when the mind is really discombobulated, sometimes there's just too much running around, and just as when you sort of sift gold out through one of those pans, you sort of sift things until the chaff separates from the grain. That's not a gold metaphor, that's wheat. It's okay. But similarly, I find sometimes actually doing walking meditation or exercise or qigong really just allows things to settle enough that you can finally see clearly. And sometimes just because otherwise you're just in a hailstorm and you don't know what to do. So sometimes it's good just to walk I know monks that have walked for 8 hours, just every day, and that's their main practice. So usually when the mind's really that bad, I'll lean towards the more robust tiers of meditation to sort of ground myself. The counterpart to that, though, is when you begin to encounter these more subtle states of meditation, it's as if you've stepped onto really thin air at the top of the mountain and you sometimes just start flailing. And in those situations, actually, you need to go more subtle. So sometimes that's what can be very helpful, like with breath meditation, maybe the sort of, the word you've attached to the breath or the noting is dropped, and then sort of a general visualization of the breath is dropped, and it's this sort of blank space, and that's where it can be really useful to just place your attention really carefully right on the thread of the breath at the nose and just follow it as continuously and lightly as you can. And that's good to keep in mind also that when you have a good day of meditation, the next day all your kilesas will probably hit you square in the head all at the same time. So I frequently, whenever I have a good meditation, I'll usually be like, tomorrow's going to just be terrible. So just know that there's a rhythm there, and it's okay. So sometimes, relying on the body to just settle things until you can see clearly. Other times, noticing if it's a flailing mechanism and just allowing yourself to jump to a more subtle level. And then sometimes, just acknowledging that the Buddha said the supreme quality is patient endurance, because sometimes we don't have the perspective to know what we're going through, and we just have to have faith and keep our head down. And in those situations, your whole task is not to fall apart, and just be with those you love, who you trust, and just keep yourself together, one foot in front of the other. And sometimes there's just too much going on to identify anything clearly, I think. Yeah. I know one person was going through a lot of a pretty intense psychological trouble, and I think this person his practice was to eat 3 cheeseburgers and then run around the meditation center for 5 hours a day, like in circles. So you may not have to go that far, but yeah. Yeah.
How do you do walking meditation?
How do we walk in meditation?
How do you do walking meditation?
Great question. So in some Burmese traditions, walking meditation is taught in a very slow means of like very slow. In our tradition, it's more a normal pace, because you want to get it cultivated to the point where you can click into it whenever you're walking. So you set a straight area about 20 paces long from end to end, and you fold your hands in front of you, not behind, because behind's a bit too informal. In front kind of keeps your mindfulness. And walk just steadily. And then Ajahn Chah would recommend sort of checking in at the middle of the path, and then you get to the end, you pause, you turn around, and you walk back. And Ajahn Chah would recommend checking in with yourself, reestablishing mindfulness at both ends and the middle every time you pass. And then the goal is really people advise different meditation objects when you're walking, but either you can just, if you lean towards breath meditation, you can just keep that going. Like if you're doing a sort of a broad visualization of the breath, running, say, up the spine and down the front of the body, or of your whole body breathing, you can just keep doing that. If you've really gotten into rhythm with your breath at the nose, then you can sort of follow that. But you can also, recite your meditation word, like Buddho, in time with the soles of your feet on the ground, like Buddho, Buddho, and just establish that. And honestly, sometimes sometimes it's nice just to let yourself relax a little when you're walking, Part of what grace, this may not be what you're referencing, but sometimes the issue is really just tying ourselves up into a knot and being like, I need to meditate, what's going on, what do I do? And just walk, You can relax a little bit, think about something else if you need to, but sometimes we just need to step back and unwind a little bit. So the body can be helpful for that. Yeah? Okay.
So talking about different reasons for trying
So Alice, the question is, this questioner has heard people speak about walking meditation, but what about standing, just in place mindfully? Yeah, that's completely all right. In fact, any of you can do standing meditation at any point during a talk. And yeah, it's quite doable, and it's also a natural transition. In terms of this tiered practice, what usually will happen is you walk for a while, and then if the mind gets really calm, you'll just stop being able to walk. You'll just kind of stand there suddenly, and you'll be like, huh. And it's okay just to stand there, and then maybe you'll get another burst, and you can walk a little longer, and then stand, and then eventually you'll want to sit, probably. But yeah, sometimes standing's really nice, and lying down is okay too, if you need to. And the caveat being that you have to determine not to move at all if you're lying down, because if you give yourself permission to move, you may just drowse off, or sort of go to sleep. So, but if you make the determination, yeah, we all have experience with this. If you make the determination not to move at all, that really helps. And I think that probably could apply a bit to standing meditation, perhaps. Bowing and full-length prostrations can be really powerful too if people know how to do that in the Tibetan style. Google full-length prostrations. They're really fun. And if you go to Bodh Gaya, you'll see just thousands of Tibetan practitioners just doing full-length prostrations, dawn till dusk. It's so unbelievable. It's also a good practice because you'll sort of do these circumambulations around the stupa, and whenever you get annoyed at how slow it's going, you realize it's because there's a Tibetan grandmother doing prostrations around the whole thing in front of you, and then you have to stop being angry and just be like unbelievably impressed. So, yeah.
We have one on the live stream here from Suminando. Why after a good meditation do kilesas come back so strongly? Is it a process of purification, like the sutta about purification of gold or cleaning of cloth?
So the question is, why do the kilesas come back hard after a good meditation, basically, or strike back with a lot of force? There's part of us which doesn't, it's a bit of both. It's because we're stepping into this, it's not necessarily, like, often in this tradition it's talked about as the Dhamma and then the kilesas, or Mara, the defilements, against each other. And you can think about it that way sometimes. We do have these forces of greed and stuff that kind of co-opt the mind, and they don't like it when we make progress against them, and so they'll fight back. And when they sense themselves threatened, they'll fight back really hard. So if you say, like, I know when I've had good Asubha meditations, for example, which is sort of contemplation of the body, the next day lust might be very strong. So it can be very clear. But I think there's a maybe more compassionate way of looking at it, in terms of it's just, this is all we've known, is this boulder we've been pushing our whole lives. We've been Sisyphus for lifetimes. And to ask Sisyphus suddenly to just be there with nothing in his hands, it's a great deal to ask him right off the bat. So my sense is you step into these refined states, you have a good meditation where a lot of these ways we have of orienting ourselves drop, and we just don't know what to do. And we exist in it for a second, but then the mind becomes afraid, and it starts marshaling every force and program it's had in the past to orient itself. And those are its kilesas and its defilements and its arguments. You can see it really clearly right after you wake up. Watch the process of how your mind tries to crystallize around something. And the easiest thing to crystallize around is the kilesa. Like, it's the argument you've been having, it's the thing you're going to have for breakfast, or it's usually a defilement. That's the easiest thing to go to for. You can see it.
And that's why when you wake up, it's so helpful to just immediately decide that you're going to crystallize around loving kindness and your meditation object. Like right when you wake up, that's your first thing. In fact, even before you get up, frequently bring your mind to your heart and just get the glow going so that your mind crystallizes around that. And that pays huge dividends throughout the day because you're changing your whole trajectory. But that's also why after a meditation that's good, it usually tends to, it's just my experience, is the path is a bit like this, like we keep hitting our old sankhara, our old sufferings again and again, but every time at a slightly more refined level. So just knowing that and not getting alarmed when the same habit pattern hits really hard, and it feels like we've made no progress, because really you have, and there's a mindfulness around it now. And you see the suffering in it more than you ever have, which is why you're able to let go of it more. But it's not fun. And suddenly you have a point of reference and contrast, too, of what it feels like to not be in that burning. And that makes it harder, too. My parents compare it to practice to kind of driving in a car and stopping suddenly and all your luggage coming and hitting you in the back of the head. So I think that might be what we have in terms of time.